Hey, how's it going, everybody? Kip here, your whiskey tour guide, and we are set for another episode of Whiskey History. Uh, on a previous video, we started the series. We are not going to go in order. We're going to just kind of jump around and do some fun stuff. We're not just going to take this arc. We're going to just talk about some fun things throughout history and how whiskey integrates into the world and realm of whiskey. In episode one, we looked at the Whiskey Trust. If you're not familiar with that, go check out the video and have a listen. Pretty interesting. Today, we are going to talk about something where whiskey and politics actually merged, what, especially at the time, was a good thing. It was when a regulation or legislation was passed that actually made sense for a change. And we are talking about the Bottled in Bond Act. And surely, if you're a fan of whiskey or if you've been in a whiskey store, you have seen that designation on a bottle of whiskey somewhere along the way. Bottled in bond or bonded, or sometimes people will call it BIB, a bottled in bond. What does that mean? What does that look like? Why did it happen in the first place? You can see here, I've got just a handful of bottles that say that. Just take, for example, this guy right here, this Ben Holiday. This is a Missouri straight bourbon whiskey, and you'll see right there, bottled in bond under U.S. government supervision. What does all that mean? Well, we're going to look at that a little bit today. In the late 1800s, whiskey producers, distillers, were making their whiskey, and then at that time they're basically selling it. It's going to be bottled, and it's going to what were called rectifiers. Rectifiers were people that were buying the whiskey, and then they were the ones who were basically selling it on the market. They were kind of that middleman, but they were also what we would today kind of classify as a modern day blender. So they're buying barrels of whiskey from various distilleries, um, and then what they were doing is doctoring it. By doctoring it, they would water it down, which is not an uncommon practice, but they were watering it down to the point that it was losing all of its potency, well below what we would recognize as an 80 proof standard, because they were trying to expand and extend their profit margin. So they're watering it down, but then just like if you take your coffee or anything else, the more water you add, not only are you diluting the product inside, but just think of the color, you're removing the color. So then these rectifiers were coming back in on the backside, and they were adding things like prune juice. I kid you not, the like the stuff from the spittle bucket of their tobacco, like chew, ding, that kind of thing. They would take that and they would add it to the whiskey back in. They were literally crushing bugs to put in to bring that color back up. And they were even adding little bits of sulfuric acid so that you would, once again, drinking that whiskey, have a little bit of the burn because they diluted it so much that had gone away. And so these rectifiers, but the thing is, then it was bottled, put on the shelf, or sold to whoever. It still had that distiller's name on that bottle. It was still their product, but it really wasn't their product anymore. It was it was an aberration. It was something that had been diluted, and not just in a good way, something that had been modified. And the whiskey producers, they were like, this is unacceptable. This is not what we want. Our name is on these bottles. Our reputation is on the line. And besides that, we enjoy and like the product we're making. We're proud of it, and we want it to stand on its own. And so they were going to go and they wanted to stop the rectifiers from being able to have that type of control over their product. So, as a result of this problem, a group of distillers got together, and honestly, what they ended up doing was forming a lobby. They created this lobby group to form legislation that would ensure the quality of their own product. Now, the guy who spearheaded this particular endeavor was a guy by the name of Colonel Edmund Hayes Taylor Jr. If you are a fan of whiskey, you may know him as Colonel E.H. Taylor. This guy right here, now part of the Buffalo Trace lineup of whiskeys, famous for his tubes that they come in, kind of like what Scotch whiskey traditionally does. And you'll notice they're bottled in bond to this day. Of the variations of Taylor, like he's got a small batch, he's got a rye, he has a single barrel. There's some various varieties. All but one are bottled in bond. That is kind of the legacy that Colonel Taylor left, was this thing bottled in bond. He's credited, and he is, because he, along with the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, John Carlisle. So Colonel Taylor, working with Secretary Carlisle, they grabbed other distilleries together, 32 of them in fact, and began to form this legislation that they were hoping would bring some protection to their product. And those 32 distillers met for the first time on June the 10th of 1880. June the 10th of 1880 at the historic Galt House in Louisville. Now, quick side note, obviously, it's a lot different today in 2023 than it was in 1880. But the Galt House in Louisville still stands. I've actually stayed there. It's a fantastic place. It's loaded with history. It has a great bar there, obviously a whiskey bar. If you ever get the chance, just for the sake of history, when you're in Louisville, make an attempt and get down to the Galt House. You don't have to stay there necessarily, even though it's cool if you do, but go there, hang out. But 1880, these 32 distillers gather at the Galt House. And what they did is they formed what was known as the Kentucky Distillers Association. Now, they're still organized today, even though it started in 1880. And they're the biggest and the strongest lobby group in the country for bourbon and whiskey, that industry in America. They are responsible for some of the things that you may know of now, maybe you've participated in. They're responsible for creating the Kentucky Bourbon Trail there in 1999. They've created the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame in 2000. And then in 2009, the creation of the Bourbon Congressional Caucus. Again, lobbying group. All of that. So the whiskey that you and I enjoy today, the whiskey that's on our shelves at home or on the shelves at the grocery store, the quality of that product was all directly related to the Bottled in Bond Act that Colonel E.H. Taylor, as well as some other distillers and Secretary Carlisle, put into play to protect not just their good name, but the juice that was inside as well. And finally, that law was passed by Congress and became an official law in 1897. You'll notice this guy right here. This is Old Forester, 1897, bottled in bond. Old Forester, they have what's called their Whiskey Row series, and each of them are a name or a date, a year, and they are something significant. So this is Old Forester's bottled in bond. That's why it's called 1897, because that is when that Bottled in Bond Act officially passed and became law. So, what does the Bottled in Bond Act actually state, or what does it actually mean? There are three rules, three things that have to qualify for something to be bottled in bond. And then there's a couple other advantages. So anytime you see this is old Evan Williams bottled in bond. On a side note, this stuff here is like less than $20 a bottle, and it's absolutely fantastic. Now, you'll notice Evan Williams bottled in bond. So what does bottled in bond mean, and how was that protecting the distillers and their juice on the inside? Three things primarily. Number one, the spirit, the whiskey inside the bottle, before it got bottled, the whiskey had to be produced by a single distillery, which meant there could be no blends. You couldn't grab something from Evan Williams and something from Henry McKenna and something from Colonel Taylor and blend them together. It had to be the product or the produced by one single distillery in a single season. Now, a season was defined 2 times a year was a season. January through June, which was the spring season, and then of course July through December, considered the fall season. So it had to be distilled at a single distillery in one of those 2 seasons. Number 2, it had to be aged in a U.S. government bonded warehouse. And you'll notice all of them here, like here, this one right here says it too, if you can read that. Bottled under U.S. government supervision, meaning that that had to be in a government bonded U.S. warehouse, and it has to be a minimum of 4 years. Now, some of them don't say this. Evan Williams, I think, is, most people say that it's 5 to 6 years. This is a fairly new one. This is out of California. This is the Redwood Empire. I'm not sure. 17, 18, 19, 20. This was a 5-year. Then, of course, you can go more, like this Henry McKenna. It's 10 years. But by law, by rule, to be bottled in bond, it has to be at least 4 years old. And then the third thing that it has to be, you'll notice on every one of these bottles behind me and any other bottled in bond that you look at, is it has to be at exactly 100 proof or 50% ABV. Why they came up with that, I don't really know for sure, other than it was the point where they wanted the fullness of that product. So those are the 3 requirements. Single distillery in a single season, government bonded warehouse for at least 4 years, and it has to be at least, or not, excuse me, not at least, it has to be exactly at 100 proof. Now, one of the other things that happened with the Bottled in Bond Act that was very good for the distillers. Now, this isn't part of the law. I mean, it is, but it's not one of the requirements, I should say, is that with the Bottled in Bond Act, because it was being aged and stored in government bonded warehouses, meaning the government had supervision, therefore the taxes were delayed. Previously, distilleries were taxed on their whiskey as it came off the still. So they had to pay taxes before they put it in a barrel and had to wait 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10 years before that product could be put on the market or be sold and they could make any money off of it. They already had to pay the taxes. So what the Bottled in Bond Act allowed them to do was not pay taxes until they bottled it, and then they were able to immediately have it on the market or sell it so that they could get some revenue. So that tax payment and receiving some revenue kind of then coincided and helped them out. And so that was a huge deal for the distilleries themselves and those distillers, is to be able to hang on to that money, that tax money, until they were ready to actually make some money off of that product. Now, with the passing of the Bottled in Bond Act It was the first of its kind in our country's history that regulated an independent actual product. And it was the closely followed in 1897, so less than 10 years later, in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, that was also known as Dr. Wiley's Law, and that was President Theodore Roosevelt's chief chemist, Harvey Wiley. And it's the first in a long line of consumer protection laws that were enacted. And it's actually the basis of today, our Food and Drug Administration. So all the regulations, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, this Pure Food and Drug Act, all of these consumer protection laws can all be traced back to the Bottled in Bond Act, the first of its kind consumer protection law. What's interesting about that, as we get ready and wrap this up, we'll try a little bit of the Old Forester Bottled in Bond here. What's really interesting about that is that it became the basis for consumer protection laws. But in its origination, what Colonel Taylor had in mind was about consumer protection, because he wanted the consumer to have a great product, but it was also about his own product. He wanted the protection of his own product so that his name, the product with his name on it, wasn't diluted, nasty, modified, all types of things. So it was really kind of a two-way street. It was ultimately a protection of his own product, but the byproduct or the result of that, even the other side of the same coin, was that the consumer was protected, so that when they picked up something with his name on it, they knew that it was going to be a quality product, just like this guy right here. Beautiful nose. Beautiful drink. Old Forester does great stuff. Here's the other thing about the Bottled in Bond Act today. I've got 8 sitting here. There are plenty others. They're not like on every other bottle on your shelf, but they do kind of come into play. But here's the fun thing. I know this Evan Williams Bottled in Bond, this Old Granddad Bottled in Bond, obviously the E.H. Taylor, which is absolutely fantastic. The Henry McKenna has been around for quite some time as a Bottled in Bond. Old Forester. So I know and recognize that those are great products that have met these acts, these laws of the Bottled in Bond Act, and they're going to be a quality product. But it also, from a consumer standpoint, if I'm going to the store and I see something that's bottled in bond, like maybe this guy who's fairly new, the old Redwood Empire out of California, when I go, ooh, a bottled in bond rye, I'm like, sweet. I know that's, first of all, that they're not sourcing. Not that there's anything wrong with that. There's some great sourced whiskeys out there. I'm not here to debate that. Look, good juice is good juice. But what I know is that they made that themselves, and it's been aging for themselves. I can go to something that's very new, like this Ben Holiday out of Missouri, right? And I can go, man, I've never had that stuff. Do I want to risk spending $50, $60, $70 on a bottle that I don't know anything about? But when I see Bottled in Bond as a consumer, it actually gives me some comfort, because I know that juice is, number one, produced by them at their distillery within 1 6-month period of time, has been aged for a minimum of 4 years, and is going to come in at 100 proof. So I know it's going to have some flavor, some taste. We're not going to get dilution there. I can trust that it's going to be a quality product. Now, is it going to hit my palate? There's always nuances. That means it's going to be the best thing I've ever had. But I know that what's inside here has met certain standards that are going to mean that it's good quality and worth something. And so as a consumer, I can be more apt to buy something that says bottled in bond than just a straight bourbon or whatever, even though that may be great. If I'm not familiar with it, I don't know. Did they make it? Is it a blend? I mean, I know there's things on the bottle that can describe all those things. But again, there's questions. This, I at least have several answers that I know specifically what they are. And one final note on bonded whiskeys, bottled in bond. For what it's worth, you can take all types of year-end reviews, the best of type things. I do them myself on my own channels. They're fun. We love that kind of stuff. But in 2022, this past December, probably the biggest publication when it comes to whiskey, Whiskey Advocate, put out their best of, or their top whiskeys of the year. And this guy right here was number one, won their whiskey of the year. And if you can't see a lot of that, you can see that it says Jack Daniels, but this is not just old number 7. This is Jack Daniels bonded, meaning that this is a one distiller, which is Jack, which we know that, one distillation season, at least 4 years, and right at 100 proof. A unique product. This is not old number 7 in the sense of because it meets those specific requirements. But this, whether I agree or not, won Whiskey of the Year for Whiskey Advocate, a bottled in bond whiskey. So there you have it. A little history on what bottled in bond means when you see it on a bottle, what it means in the context of history, and how the Bottled in Bond Act was the lead up to many consumer safety laws that we have even in this country to this day. So, raise your glass to knowing that what's inside the glass is good quality juice. Until next time, cheers.